Jura is an island in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland, adjacent and to the northeast of Islay. Compared with its fertile and more populous neighbour, Jura is mountainous, bare and infertile, covered largely by vast areas of blanket bog, hence its small population. In a list of the islands of Scotland ranked by size, Jura comes 8th, whereas ranked by population it comes 31st. It is in the council area of Argyll and Bute. History. Evidence of settlements on Jura dating from the Mesolithic period was first uncovered by the English archaeologist John Mercer in the 1960s. There is evidence of Neolithic settlement at Pol Esheo in the southwest of the island. The modern name, Jura, dates from the Norse Gael era and is from the Old Norse Dyroi meaning beast island. In the 6th century, it is believed that Jura may have been the location of Hinba, the island to which the Irish founder of the Christian Church in Scotland, St. Columba, retreated for prayer and contemplation from the monastic community which he founded on Iona. The Vikings. The Viking occupation of the Hebrides began in the 9th century, and was formalized when sovereignty was secured in 1098. For this point, Norse rule continued until 1266, when the Hebrides, together with Kintyre and the Isle of Man, were ceded to Scotland in the Treaty of Perth. A key figure during the Norse period was the warlord Somerled, whose descendants, for around 150 years from the mid-14th century, styled themselves Lords of the Isles. The Lords of the Isles. The lordship of the Isles was dominated by Clan Donald, whose seat was at Finlagan on Islay. The lordship came to an end in 1493, but Clan Donald continued to rule the southern part of Jura, through the MacDonalds of Duniveg. The north of the island, however, was owned by this time by Clan Maclean, whose seat was at Arras Castle in Glengarrisdale. In 1647, this was to be the site of a notable battle between the Macleans and the Campbells of Craignish. For many years in the 20th century, a human skull stood on a ledge in a nearby cave, and it was traditionally said to have been the remains of a Maclean who had been killed in this battle. The skull is no longer there, but the latest editions of Ordnance Survey maps still mark the location as Maclean's Skull Cave. The Campbells. The demise of the Lords of the Isles at the end of the 15th century was shortly followed in 1506 by the Treaty of Camas and Stacker, which removed MacDonald rights on Jura and gave them to the Campbells. Despite this, the 16th century was a period of skirmishing between the warring clans, MacDonalds, Campbells, Macleans and others. Then in 1607 the Campbells finally bought the island from the MacDonalds. This was the beginning of some 300 years during which the island was ruled and largely owned by 11 successive Campbell lairds. The north of the island, however, remained in Maclean hands until 1737, when it was sold to Donald MacNeill of Colonsay. Emigration. For the mid-18th century, long before the notorious Highland clearances of the 19th century, there were a number of waves of emigration from Jura. In 1767, 50 people left Jura for Canada, and from that point the population gradually shrank from over 1,000 to its 20th century level of just a few hundred. Mercer notes that although relatively few forced clearances were recorded as taking place on Jura, the emigrations were far from voluntary, and were the result of factors such as hunger and spiraling rents. Recent and current ownership. During the first half of the 20th century, the Campbells gradually sold the island as a number of separate estates, and the Campbell connection with Jura ended in 1938 with the sale of Jura House and the Ardfan estate. There are now 7 estates on Jura, all in separate ownership, with 6 of the 7 held by absentees: Ardfan, Inver, Jura Forest, Tarbert, Ruin Torland, Ardluss Water, and Barn Hill. There is also a relatively small area owned by Forestry Commission Scotland. Barn Hill was the home of British novelist George Orwell, who lived there intermittently from 1946 until his death in January 1950, and who completed his novel 1984 while living there. Despite its isolation, Barn Hill has in recent years become something of a shrine for his readers. The Ardfan estate is situated at the southern tip of the island, between Feeland and Craighouse. For some 70 years from 1938, Ardfan belonged to the Riley Smith family, brewers from Tadcaster in Yorkshire. In 2010 the estate was bought by Greg Coffey, an Australian hedge fund manager, and since then the famous walled garden of Jura House, which had previously been a popular tourist attraction, has been closed to the public. Having also wound up the estate's farm, Mr. Coffey then submitted proposals for the construction of a private 18-hole golf course on the estate, which is due to be completed in 2016. North of Ardfan, and flanking the Paps of Jura, lie the estates of Forest and Inver. Forest Estate, on the east side of the Paps, belongs to Samuel, 3rd Baron Vestey, chairman of the food and farming business Vestey Group Limited, and master of the horse of the royal household. Below the west slopes of the Paps lies Inver Estate, which belongs to Sir William Lithgow, vice-chairman of the Glasgow Shipbuilding Group Lithgows. North of the Corrin River, and stretching as far as Loch Tarbert, is the Tarbert Estate. Former Prime Minister David Cameron has visited the estate on several occasions. It is sometimes reported that the 20,000-acre estate is owned by his wife's stepfather Lord Astor, although the ownership of the Tarbert Estate is in the hands of Ginge Manor Estates Limited, based in Nassau in the Bahamas, and there is no means of verifying who the beneficial absentee owners are. North of Loch Tarbert is ruined Orlin, which was created when the northern half of the Tarbert estate was sold off in 1984. It is owned by businessman Lindsay Berry, who is a former president of the influential wildlife charity Flora and Fauna International. The north of Jura belongs to two members of the Fletcher family. The owner of Ardlusser is Andrew Fletcher, who lives at Ardlusser House with his family. They are the only estate owners to be permanently resident on Jura, and at the northernmost tip of Jura, overlooking the famous Corrie Vrecan whirlpool, is the Barn Hill Estate, which is owned by Jamie Fletcher. Geography. With an area of 36,692 hectares, or 142 square miles, and only 196 inhabitants recorded in the 2011 census, Jura is much less densely populated than neighbouring Islay and is one of the least densely populated islands of Scotland. Census records show that Jura's population peaked at 1,312 in 1831, and that, in common with many areas of western Scotland, the island's population declined steadily over the ensuing decades. However, there has been a small increase since 2001. During the same decade, Scottish island populations as a whole grew by 4% to 103,702. Alongside the long-term decline in Jura's population has been a decline in the number of Gaelic speakers. The 1881 census reported that 86.6% spoke Gaelic. In 1961, for the first time, less than half spoke the language, and by 2001, this figure had dropped to 10.6%. The main settlement is the village of Craighouse on the east coast. Craighouse is home to the Jura distillery, producing Isle of Jura single malt whisky. The village is also home to the island's only hotel, shop and church. Between the northern tip of Jura and the island of Scarborough lies the Gulf of Corrie Vrecan, where a whirlpool makes passage dangerous at certain states of the tide. The southern part of the island, from Loch Tarbert southwards, is one of 40 national scenic areas in Scotland. Geology. The Isle of Jura is composed largely of Dale radian quartzite, a hard metamorphic rock which provides the jagged surface of the paps. Throughout the western half of the island, the quartzite has been penetrated by a number of linear basalt dikes which were formed during a period of intense volcanic activity in the lower tertiary period, some 56 million years ago. These dikes, the most apparent on the west coast, where erosion of the less resistant rock into which they are intruded has left them exposed as natural walls. The west coast is also home to a number of raised beaches, which are regarded as a geological feature of international importance. Economy. In an economic survey published in 2005 by the now-defunct Phelan Study Centre on Jura, the gross turnover of the island was estimated to be just over £3.2 million. This figure covered production and services only, and took no account of public expenditure by government or local authority. In terms of financial size, the Jura distillery was the largest, and it was also the biggest individual employer, but the island's 7 estates, taken together, employed the most full and part-time staff. The distillery is owned by White & Mackay, which since 2007 has been part of the United Breweries Group of India, so very little of its considerable profits remain on Jura. The estates provide deer stalking and other field sports, together with forestry and a diminishing amount of agriculture. Tourism is the only other significant area of economic activity, and in 2005 over 20% of the island population was directly or indirectly employed in the tourist industry. The distillery, field sports and Jura House Gardens were listed as the main tourist attractions, although the gardens have since been closed to the public. In 2013, Jura Development Trust secured financial support from the Big Lottery Fund and other sources to purchase the island's only shop, which reopened as a community-owned business in 2014. The Trust is also exploring renewable energy options. Transport. Jura lies close to the Scottish mainland, and yet it is often described as remote. The island's most distinguished resident, George Orwell, famously described it as extremely unagitatable. Quote, "This may be because it has no direct air ferry link to the mainland, apart from a seasonal passenger ferry service which runs from the village of Tavalick near Loch Gilfed. Most travellers to Jura go by Calmac car ferry from Craig on the Kintyre Peninsula to Islay, and then cross to Jura from Port Ascaig on Islay by the MV Ellendura, a small vehicle ferry which is run by ASP ships on behalf of Argyll and Bute Council. Islay can also be reached by air. Islay Airport is served by daily flights from Glasgow and twice weekly from Oban. Jura has only one road of any significance, the single-track A846, which follows the southern and eastern coastline of the island from Phelan Ferry to Craighouse, a distance of around 8 miles. The road then continues to Lag Tarbert, Ardlusser and beyond. A private track runs from the road end to the far north of the island. A local bus service on the island is operated by Gairloch Head Coaches. Wildlife. The island has a large population of red deer, and it is commonly believed that the name Jura is derived from Hjortr, the Old Norse word for deer. Through browsing, the deer prevent the vegetation on the island from turning back to woodland, which is the natural climax community. Indeed, an alternative explanation of the island's name is that it derives from the great quantity of yew trees which grew in the island in earlier times. Jura is also noted for its bird life, and especially for its raptors, including buzzards, golden eagles, white-tailed eagles, and hen harriers. Since 2010, Jura has been designated by Scottish Natural Heritage as a special protection area for golden eagles. Like many other parts of the Hebrides and western Scotland, the shores of Jura are frequented inhabited by grey seals, and the elusive otter is also relatively common here, as is the adder, the UK's only venomous snake. Paps of Jura. The island is dominated by three steep-sided conical quartzite mountains on its western side, the Paps of Jura, which rise to 785 meters. There are three major peaks. Ben Oir is the highest peak, standing at 2,575 feet, and is thereby a Corbett. Ben Chiantide stands at 2,477 feet high. Ben Charle is the lowest of the Paps, reaching 2,408 feet. The Paps dominate the landscape in the region and can be seen from the Mull of Kintyre and, on a clear day, Skye and Northern Ireland. The route of the annual Isle of Jura Fell race includes all three Paps and four other hills. These hills were the subject of William McTaggart's 1902 masterpiece The Paps of Jura, now displayed in the Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. Literary accounts. In 1549, Donald Munro, Dean of the Isles, wrote that the island was a nathafine forest for dire inhabit and manured at the coast side, with fresher water loches, with Michael of Profit, and an abundance of salmon. However, when the soldier and military historian Sir James Turner visited Jura in 1632, he was less impressed, reporting that a horrid island, a habitation fit for deer and wild beasts. But at the end of the 17th century, the writer and traveller Martin went there and concluded that this isle is perhaps the wholesomest plot of ground either in the Isles or continent of Scotland, as appears by the long life of the natives and the state of health. Martin noted some extraordinary examples of longevity, including one Guillaume Crane, who was alleged to have kept 180 Christmases in his own house, and he was impressed by the good health of the inhabitants. There is no epidemical disease that prevails here. Fevers are but seldom observed by the natives, and any kind of flux is rare. The gout and agues are not so much as known by them, neither are they liable to sciatica, convulsions, vapors, palsies, surfeits, lethargies, megrims, consumptions, rickets, pains of the stomach, or coughs, are not frequent here, and none of them are at any time observed to become mad. Culture. Like all inhabited Hebridean islands, Jura has its own indigenous tradition of Gaelic song and poetry. Since 1993 it has also been the home to the Jura Music Festival, which takes place annually in September. Towards the north end of Jura, some miles beyond the end of the metalled road, is Barn Hill, a remote house where the novelist George Orwell spent much of the last 3 years of his life. Orwell was known to the residents of Jura by his real name, Eric Blair. It was at Barn Hill that Orwell finished 1984, during 1947-48, while critically ill with tuberculosis. He sent the final typescript to his publishers, Secker and Wahlberg, on the 4th of December 1948, who published the book on the 8th of June 1949. Jura is also known for an event that took place on the 23rd of August 1994, when Bill Drummond and Jimmy Quartey, known then as the music group the KLF, filmed themselves burning £1 million in banknotes in the Ardfern boathouse on the south coast of the island. Jura is featured in the plot of the 2003 novel A Question of Blood by Ian Rankin, the 2007 novel The Careful Use of Compliments by the Scottish writer Alexander McCall Smith, and is a setting for some of the narrative and action in Anne Michael's 2008 novel The Wind of Alt. In music, Jura is mentioned in Crossing to Jura, a song by R. Kennedy and D. MacDonald, recorded in 1997 by JCB with Jerry Holland on the album A Trip to Cape Breton. The Bends of Jura, a song by Kappa Cayley, and Isle of Jura, a song by Skyclad. The 2010 album Poets and Lighthouses by Tuvan singer Albert Kuvezan of the band Yat Kha was recorded and produced by the the British musician Giles, appearing on Jura, with some of the performances being recorded in the forest at Lag. The album reached number 1 in the European World Music Charts in January 2011.